The North American Society for Oceanic History was created by maritime scholars who met in 1971 at the University of Maine. They recognized that in North America there was no forum for maritime history or a society devoted to the study and promotion of maritime history. The aim of the original group of organizers was to create a diverse organization based initially on Canadian and American membership, which would gain the interest of others. Now there are members worldwide, and it is this diversity of membership that continues to make NASO a truly unique organization. 2020 marked the first year in recent memory that NASO was unable to meet, and therefore we bring historians, archaeologists, and students who are scheduled to present. Welcome to the North American Society for Oceanic History video podcast. I'm your host, Sal Mercogliano. The goal of the NASO podcast is to bring you some of the best historians, professionals, and up-and-comers in the field of maritime history. Today we're heading to the Gulf Coast, specifically Alabama, and being joined by Dr. John Bratten. John is the chair of the Department of Anthropology at the University of West Florida. Dr. Bratten will be discussing a topic, elemental mercury recovered from the 1559 Luna settlement and shipwrecks. Welcome, John, to the NASO video and podcast.
Hi, thanks for bringing me on. I just kind of want to clarify one thing.
Sure,
we're really talking about Pensacola. I just happen to be in Alabama today for this podcast, but we're going to give the rightful place as Pensacola, Florida is what we're really talking about today.
Well, you're exactly right, because I was going to come back to that, because it's really great to have you on this podcast, because the whole reason we're doing this is because of the cancellation of our conference that was scheduled to be down in Pensacola, Florida, hosted by University of Western Florida. Our current president of NASO, Dr. Amy Mitchell-Cook, she's the chair of the history department there. You're the chair of the anthropology department. And I am not going to lie when I tell you we had an entire Friday day. The very first day of the conference was kind of set aside to talk about this site you're going to talk about, and a whole series of archaeology, anthropology, and maritime history from that site. So it's very, very appropriate we have you on to kind of set the tone for this. So I was wondering if you can set some context for us. So obviously we're going to talk all about this landscape of the Tristan de Luna settlement and some of the shipwrecks down there. So I was wondering if you could give us the context and the background of that site.
So the Spanish, of course, had been in Mexico prior to 1559 and discovered the riches of the New World. And so there was fear that other European countries, particularly the French, might come into the same area, set up a port where they could attack Spanish ships. And so to protect their own interests, they wanted another port, an establishment where they could help protect their, basically all these ships that would be going back and forth between the New World and Spain. And so Pensacola was known to them because it had been visited earlier by earlier Spanish expeditions. And so it was known to have a deep harbor, and it was said to be sheltered and be protected from all storms. And so Don Tristan de Luna y Arellano was put in charge of this. And so this was royally funded. It would be the biggest colonization attempt. And eventually, it was going to include 1,500 colonists. It involved 12 ships. It was going to be a two-part thing. There was going to be, the colony would be established at Pensacola, and then there would be a colony on the east coast of the United States, Santa Elena, and then they would be connected in by an overland road. So very ambitious at the time. And so supplies were gathered from Mexico, supplies were brought over on ships from Spain. Eventually all these things, horses, 200 horses, were all loaded on these ships. And then the Spanish sailed from Veracruz, Mexico. The voyage actually took about 7 weeks. Then they had trouble with the horses. The horses were sick and dying. They overshot Pensacola Bay, probably went about as far as St. Mark's, Florida, came back towards where Mobile is today, offloaded the horses, brought them overland, and then came into Pensacola Bay. So they chose a land site, which for years eluded us, although we now know where the land site is, and we actually have an archaeological project going on there since 2016 as well. And so 5 weeks after they landed, there was a hurricane. And from Luna's description, it sounded like it was a Category 5 storm. And the storm blew from all directions for 24 hours. And at the end of it, the Spanish had lost 7 of the ships that were in the bay at the time. So 6 of them really sank. More so, they grounded in shallow areas where the hurricane pushed them. And then 1 was actually blown up on land, and that one was destroyed. So, there's a lot of history behind all this, but the first shipwreck was found in 1992, and it was found by Dr. Roger Smith. He was Florida State underwater archaeologist. And a lot of people, knew Roger. Unfortunately, Roger passed away this past February. But Roger invited me to come to the project in 1994. And so at that point, I worked for the Florida Bureau of Archaeological Research. And my job was to act as the conservator for the project, to take care of all the artifacts that we would recover. And then I was also a member of the diving team, which was pretty small back then. There were really four of us in Pensacola, and then Roger would come from Tallahassee. But the first Emmanuel Point shipwreck, then we associated with the fleet of Luna. And we worked on that from the time of its discovery in 92 all the way up to 1998.
So let me put some more context here for this. So this settlement that's setting up, so this is predating, early Spanish settlements in North America. So this is predating St. Augustine. This is a very early, obviously, settlement going into what is today the modern day United States.
Right. It was the largest settlement attempt at the time. The first one to be royally funded. St. Augustine was founded in 1565, and this is 1559. The colony only lasted for 2 years for a number of reasons. One, because the hurricane gave them such a disadvantage to begin with. The Spanish had been advised that their food supplies would be safer if they left them on board the ships. So even though they'd been in Pensacola for about 5 weeks, most of the supplies were still on board the ships anchored nearby where the settlement was just being built. And so that was a devastating loss to lose all that. Tristan de Luna wasn't that effective of a leader. And so it floundered from the get-go. He sent quite a few of his military, because there were colonists, and then he had a military force as well. And so they went up into Alabama, all the way up to North Georgia, really where the mountains are, looking for Coosa, looking to be able to trade with the Native Americans to bring back food to these colonists. And then eventually, one of the ships that survived the storm, though, was sent back to Mexico, reported on the disaster, and then over a period of 2 years, relief ships were sent that eventually picked up the colonists, and then it was all completely abandoned in 1561.
So the wrecks in the settlement themselves, with the geography of Pensacola, large bay type area it is, these are all inside the bay area, or they're outside?
No, they're well in the bay. In fact, they're 9 miles from Pensacola Pass to go out to the Gulf of Mexico. That was one of the reasons why the Spanish had chosen this area, because the bay is so large and you can travel way up there. Ultimately, they picked a high point of land overlooking this particular part of the bay. There was access to fresh water, and so the site location, was really good. It makes a lot of sense, once you really know where it is. And then we, had surmised that the ships could have been blown all over the bay because of the storm. So the first one was found in 1992. University of West Florida found the second one in 2006. And then we found the third one in 2016. So we found 3 of them. And then also in 2016, the actual settlement site was found. So it's kind of a perfect research world, because we have both the ships and the land site. We can compare the artifacts and really hope to tell a more complete story of what the colony was actually like.
What kind of evidence are you getting from, and material culture wise, are you getting from, let's say the land site first, and then we can talk about the ships themselves? What are we learning about these early colonists that came in that makes them unique?
Well, these were not rich people. These were people that were really wanting to start, life in a new place, and ultimately, they hope to find their own riches this way. And so what we find remnants of some of the food, remnants of some of the clothing things on the land site, brass pins, lots of olive jar fragments, even some items associated with Aztecs, because we know that there were Aztec warriors had been recruited for this mission as well. And so there's some Aztec pottery and some other items. We found some obsidian on both the land and both on the shipwrecks to tie that connection in. On the land side, copper crossbow points, iron fasteners survive. A few fragments, probably from some of the building structures that show up as stains in the soil. As you'd mentioned earlier, we had intended to do a whole day of presentation, and so Dr. John Worth in particular was going to talk about the work on the land site, as well as a number of our graduate students, who are working with various aspects from that. My association is, I've been fortunate enough, I've been able to work on all three of the shipwrecks that have been found, and really become familiar with all the artifacts found on those shipwrecks as well. And so we can make good comparisons between those.
When we look, let's shift on over to the ships then and talk about those a little bit. What type of ships are we talking about? How are they used as a base of operation? You're talking about the food being stored on board, so we assume for the time fairly large vessels to be able to sustain this kind of base of operation until they can be established ashore. So what kind of material culture are you getting from the ships themselves?
Well, for the ships are the three that we've found so far. They're all located in shallow water. The first two are in just 12 feet of water. The third one kind of surprised us because it's actually only in 7 feet of water. But what we have are the bottom parts of the ship that were covered by the ballast, and the stone ballast protected that. And then all three ships are relatively close to the outlet of a bayou, which carried silts and sediments. It covered up these parts that survived them in an anaerobic environment. And so we had incredible organic preservation, but we have everything really that was below the water line where that ballast area was. And then for instance, in the case of the second one we found, we call it Emmanuel Point 2. In that one, we thought we'd found a third ship because off the stern of that vessel, we found much more articulated ship timbers, but it turned out that's actually probably part of the port side of the ship that was torn off when the ship pounded up and down on the sandbar during the hurricane and then landed behind the ship. So that one, we have more of the vessel, which is really going to help us, say what they look like. We know the names of all the ships. We have some of the payrolls for the ships, and so we get a pretty good idea of it. But there's galleons and what's Spanish called a nau, and then a fragata or a frigate. There was a caravel, but the caravel survived the storm. So archaeologists haven't really had a chance to work on a caravel. We'd love to, but that one we won't find. But the first two ships, Emmanuel Point 1 and Emmanuel Point 2, are both very large ships for the time, 400 to 500 tons, well over 100 feet on deck. And so they're sizable vessels, and, in the range of, what we would call a galleon.
Is that fairly typical of the size vessels you're seeing, or are these unusual compared to what the Spanish were using at the time along the Gulf of Mexico coast and in their conquest there of the Caribbean area?
No, I think, these are typical of what we would expect to find, but from this time period, that's one of the reasons why this is so important. We don't have ship plans laid out showing exactly how they were built. And, this we're adding to that knowledge base of, the ships from this time period that have been found of, what are the scantlings, the dimensions, the outer hull planking, how was the mast step built and designed, the pump wells on the ship. And so all these things, we're documenting, and we can add to that to this. Really, it's a small collection worldwide of ships from this time period, and so the ships are all a little different. We don't know much about Emmanuel Point 3, the one that was most recently discovered. That one, we've only started the excavation out there. We only have a few square meters uncovered, but we're again seeing intact hull remains. We don't know whether it's one of the larger ships or one of the smaller ships at this point yet. It does appear to be one that was built in the Old World. It's a European type white oak. All three ships are actually built out of European white oak. We know that. The work's going to continue long after I've left the University of West Florida, and it's proven to be beneficial research for all the faculty as well as graduate students, and we're also able to engage undergraduate students too, and they take on projects as well.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that process. I think it's a really amazing process. The idea that, I don't know how far this is from the university, but it's fairly close. I mean, most, underwater archaeology sites, you have to travel quite a long distance to get there. This sounds like it's right across the bay from you guys. So that sounds like it's really convenient, number one. But number two is what's the mechanism behind this? I mean, how do you pull in, both the departments in your university, and what kind of scopes of work are you giving students, grad students, faculty members for this?
Well, it takes a lot of people to do all this, and so we've really worked out a good plan. And so we have at the University of West Florida, we call it the Division of Anthropology and Archaeology. So it includes the Department of Anthropology, which is where the academic side is, where we offer the programs for the students, undergraduates and graduate students as well. We have a MA in Historical Archaeology, which is kind of unique. So students can really focus in on archaeology as well. And then we have the Archaeology Institute on campus. It's properly called the Margaret J. Smith Archaeology Institute, which we use to do grants and contracts and things like that. And we also have FPAN, which is headquartered in Pensacola, the Florida Public Archaeology Network. And we work with, those fine folks as well. And then we also have what's known as Marine Services, which serves the entire university, but it's where we keep our boats, and we have a dive locker, we have a dive safety officer, we have boat mechanics. So we can ensure the safety of everyone that's working on the projects, on the underwater sites as well. So we also work with other departments. Right now, I'm doing collaborative research with biology because we're looking at ancient DNA, trying to isolate DNA from some of the, on the Emmanuel Point ships, we had the first physical evidence for chickens in the New World, the actual chicken bones. And so that's been an interesting topic about when chickens cross the Atlantic to get to the New World. But we have a cat, which I'm trying to isolate DNA from a cat, which, that's the type of things that I'm really interested in. Earliest pig and the earliest actual rats and all these type of things. So, I work with the biology folks. We've worked with folks in chemistry, analyzing, trying to identify some of the resins that we found on board the ship, do neutron activation analysis. And of course, we've had a long relationship with history on campus, that are helping us, with documentary research. And so they're actively engaged in this as well. And so it's worked out great for that. And, we have other collaborations where we've brought in students from other universities to come and take part in the field schools. And those are always welcome to bring new faces in. And so, yeah, it's multidisciplinary for sure.
Well, that cross-disciplinary sounds fantastic. I mean, I always love programs like that, and I think it's such great exposure for students to get that too, to be able to see how different areas work together, complement each other, and at the same time support each other, which I think it sounds like your program is doing great. I want to go back to one thing you mentioned, because I didn't hear you talk about this yet. Was there any evidence of Native American culture and the interaction between the settlements and it? Was this an area that had already been devoid of Native Americans because of disease, or was there any indication of interaction between these Spanish settlers and Native Americans?
There's some Native American components that have been identified on the settlement site, but those may actually predate and postdate the actual colonization site. As it turned out, the Native Americans weren't in great numbers on the coast near Pensacola. Larger numbers were more so up in Alabama. But John Worth, from the documents, has found then, specific encounters where some of the Luna soldiers then had traveled north, looking to do this, but because of, Ponce de Leon and some of the earlier ones, the Native Americans were not that welcoming. And so there's actually, evidence for some skirmishes that they had against the Spanish. And so I had a student several years ago did a neat thesis topic. She was actually looking at European type artifacts that have been recovered from Native American sites, mostly in Alabama, some in Georgia. So it does probably indicate that trade did happen and did occur. And so she looked at some of the metal artifacts using XRF, X-ray diffraction, looking at the actual, specific composition of the metals, trying to associate those with artifacts from Luna, and found some parallels that, that looked real promising that that was the case. But we've seen it that way, but in the immediate Pensacola area, not that much.
Yeah, I wonder how much the impact of weather and not being on the coast when these hurricanes come in is an impact for that. Talking about the hurricane and the finding of the wrecks, obviously you said, I think there was 5 ships that were lost and you found 3 so far, if I'm correct.
7 were lost and we found 3.
Obviously work is probably being done to locate those other wrecks, and knowing that geography of that Gulf Coast and having seen hurricanes hit in the past, I mean, it's not unusual to see massive flooding in the coastal areas, and ships could have been picked up and dropped almost anywhere in that area. So how much work is being done to kind of locate these other wrecks, or are you just focusing on the 3 you have right now?
Well, after the first one was found in 92, then that one really was the primary focus. The surveys sort of stopped at that point for really the next 6 years. And we did that. And then we picked up the search again then in 2006. And so we were lucky we got a special category grant from the Florida Division of Historical Resources to start the survey again. So all 3 of these wrecks have been found with a magnetometer. And so the second one turned out to only be within a half mile of the first one. So the first one actually had a fairly good amount of the ballast still sticking up above the sand. And so at that time, magnetometers, weren't quite as sensitive as they are today, but it did give a reading that warranted someone going in and, doing a circle search underwater, and then they found the ballast pile and found the ship. The second one, we had a target magnetic anomaly. It wasn't near as strong as the first one, but systematically we had a number of these targets, and we would use the field school students to test these. And so we would pick out a number that looked promising for the day. That would be the goal. We'd go out there and we'd typically send 2 students down at a time, and usually a graduate student and undergraduate student. They would do a typical circle search. If nothing was immediately visible, then we take fiberglass probes and we probe in the sand. And that's exactly what happened. They did just what they were, supposed to do, and then encountered ballast stone, just under the sand. And then I was actually on the survey boat where we were pulling the magnetometer, and they called and said, this had happened. And I said, well, probe it out, see if you can get kind of an overall length. And then they did that. And it was about 14 meters, which looked real promising. And so the next day, of course, we went back to that site, and we didn't have a dredge and fill permit and any of that, but we did some hand fanning and quickly, found ballast. And then very quickly we found some olive jar pottery. And that led to the discovery of the second one that way. So we worked on Emmanuel Point 2 from really 2006 to 2016. We've been fortunate, we've been able to offer a field school every summer and, take students to train. This is the first summer because of the pandemic, we had to cancel our field school. But as part of the field school, they may get to go out one day and they're going to work on the shipwreck, and they're going to learn how to use the water induction dredge, set up grids, learn how to map underwater, learn those skills. Well, then another group of them that same day, we're going to send them out in a smaller boat with a magnetometer or side scan sonar. We're going to teach them remote sensing techniques. And then yet another boat, we may send out several students with a senior grad student. They're going to go out and target dive on some of the anomalies that we found. So we find many things that don't turn out to be Luna ships, and it takes a long time. We did find other interesting things, of course, but in 2016, we found the third ship by that same method on a target that, it looked good, but because it was only in 7 feet of water, we thought that might be too shallow, but as it turned out to be, again, we quickly located, some of the things we wanted to find, quickly, like olive jar, strips of lead sheathing, the ballast, and then some, articulated wood, and then found the third one that way. So we're going to continue to survey, and all during as part of field school. If we're fortunate, we get a large grant, like a special category grant from the state of Florida, then we can actually work year round and do that as well.
Well, I think you're fortunate you have the environment where you can do that and definitely be able to work year round. I'm interested too in the idea of what do we do with this information? As a graduate of the East Carolina program, one of the big things that I do as a historian now, I don't do as much diving as I ever did, but one of the things I like to do is be able to use archaeology and anthropology in my history research, be able to use that material and incorporate it in it. What's your department and your university doing right now to take the facts, the images, the archaeology, the anthropology, the history from these sites, and put them out there in forms and formats that are good for professionals, but also for the public in general?
Well, the Emmanuel Point 1 has now been published in book form. And so Roger Smith took the lead on that. And so that book you can buy now, Florida's Lost Galleon. And so that's an excellent publication with chapters from all of us who worked on the first wreck and other people that came in later to work for the history, John Worth in particular. And so we really took everything we knew about the first wreck and put it into that volume. We've made many conference presentations as well and all that. We published articles on what we're finding from Emmanuel Point 2, which could certainly lead to the second book in this series. And then we're already at the point where we could start to present about Emmanuel Point 3, which may well have been presented at NASAL. We do that, but there's been more work probably just in the form of master's theses. And so students, they'll pick, an area like they're looking at artifacts from Mesoamerican artifacts, just those, to go into real detail on those, or the faunal assemblage, or the floral assemblage. And so those were theses that have been produced already, are just in-depth looks at the ceramics that we're finding. So tremendous, amount of research goes into it and provides that source for that, which is really good. I have a science background, so I'm the chair of the anthropology department, and my doctorate's in anthropology, but from the Texas A&M Nautical Archaeology program. And but I've always thought, I think, like a scientist and try to apply what I learned there. And so my own particular research is working with the artifacts, but what can they tell us? And so doing things to elucidate that. Right now I'm working with trying to isolate ancient DNA from some of these things, which I think's fascinating. To really talking about some of the early livestock that was brought over as part of the Columbian exchange. And then, the paper that I was going to present at Nassau relates to the mercury that we found on all three of the wrecks so far. But we've done isotope studies, we've done neutron activation analysis. We're doing a good bit of work with the wood itself. We brought over a dendrochronologist from Wales, from Trinity St. David in Wales, to help us sample the wreck, to really get an idea of what type of wood is it. And but that's part of a bigger study, which really is looking at 16th century European forestry the process for that, practices. It's also, because we know the age of the ships, we can take the ship timbers, and they're taking tiny wood samples from each ring, and they do carbon-14 on that. And by doing so, that helps to calibrate the world's radiocarbon scale. So if we get a C14 day today, we may be plus or minus 50 years, something like that. But with enough work like this, we may be able to say, plus or minus 5 years. So that's, other work that's happening, in collaboration with universities overseas.
I think, first off, we're going to have a batch of your grad students on that we've already got them booked to come on. So we're looking forward to having a little bit more in-depth discussion on each of those little subtopics you talked about. There's some really interesting ones. Again, I go back to that schedule we had for that Friday of the NATO Conference, and it was going to be an all-day event with you chairing a panel. I know Greg Cook was going to do one, and a whole batch of other panels on that. So I'm really looking forward to it. I'm really hoping that next year, if everything gets going and we're back in Pensacola in May, we get to even hear more in-depth analysis of what's going on there. Talking about the science aspect, again, I think that's absolutely fascinating. I think all too often as a historian, we tend to think that every primary, any source has to be a piece of paper with someone's written something on it in the past. But I think your element of looking at science and really being able to look at the breakdown and understand things like the DNA passage of material is so important. I was wondering if you could go a little bit more in that. You talked about the cat, you talked about the chicken. There's a joke in there somewhere about the chicken coming to America, but I'll avoid that if I can. But why is that so important for understanding this event? Because again, this is 1559. This is 70 years before the English come over and settle North America. But here we're seeing the first introduction, at least we know of, into the North American area of European culture in a large measure. And why is that so important for us to understand today?
Well, I think it's important because it tells us things we don't always expect sometimes. For instance, the cat was surprising. We've recovered faunal material in the builds of the ship, and the organic preservation's great. So we have these things. We have a colleague, Kathy Parker. She does all the faunal analysis for us. And so we'll give her these specimens that we found, and then she'll tell us these wonderful things sometimes, that surprises. We really expect to find chicken, pig, and sheep and goat and things like that. Okay, well, you can't differentiate sheep and goat easily from just the faunal specimens. They're too close. And so, well, I want to know, are they sheep or are they goat? Which ones were they utilizing? And so we can do that with DNA, though. And so that's one of the things we're doing. Another thing we're doing with DNA is, this is a thesis topic for one of my grad students, Cassandra Sadler. I'm kind of jealous of it because I really liked the idea, but she's looking at olive jars. And so we have olive jars are the big storage jars that they carry things in. And historically, as you mentioned, in the documents, they carried wine and they carried water and honey and milk and things like that. But, what did they really carry in them for that? So the ones that carried liquids, they coated the insides with a resin called Pez. It's pine pitch is what it is. And they sealed them up with that, and otherwise the vessel would be too porous, and it would eventually, your liquids would kind of evaporate out. So she took resin samples, the Pez, from 3 of these olive jar sherds, from each different wreck, and we sent those off for pollen analysis to look, if it was wine, maybe we could find grape pollen and be able to say, this is what it carried. Well, we found pine pollen, which isn't a surprise, but in one of them we found lots and lots of insect type pollen that insects would have carried, not windborne pollen. Okay, well then that suggests that the vessel was full of honey. Is where all that pollen came from. So now we've taken that, a step further. We're scraping the inside walls of the olive jars. We're also taking some of that same Pez, and we're looking for DNA. And so we're specifically trying to find out if we can find grape DNA inside these things to say, yes, that they were carrying wine in these things, or vinegar, something like that. Or if we can isolate other types of DNA, maybe it'll tell us they were carrying different things. So we're not the first group to do that, but our preservation's really good. So we're trying that right now. But really to get an idea of, what did these cattle look like? The cattle probably came from Spain, but what did they look like? The sheep, the goat, they were introduced to this world. How have they changed from today? People are interested in that, just the evolution of, how the animals have been adapted by man and such, to see what these early ones were like. The chicken story is fun because it's been somewhat controversial. There's been the story that, chickens were in Polynesia and brought that way. And then, there are people, said that the dates were wrong, that there was what they call the old carbon effect because they were feeding them marine products. And so marine products have old carbon in them, which throws off the dates and different things like that. And so, but if you, look at it, these chicken bones, there aren't any in North America that are earlier than these, the ones from our shipwrecks right now that actually have the bones to try to do that. We've isolated DNA right now. And so the next thing is then to sequence it and, to match up the pieces and to see how they correspond to other chicken samples to get an idea of, were they scrawny chickens or, what were they really like? The cat story is one of mine I like a lot. Mary Rose has a dog. There's a ship in England called Catwater Wreck, which has a dog. Dogs are actually better ratters. Okay, so cats weren't well thought of in the 16th century. So the whole idea that there's a cat on board is kind of interesting. You think, well, maybe the captain liked cats and stuff. The church frowned on cats because they were associated with religious, views that, the Celtic peoples had cats and the Egyptians worshipped cats. And so the cats weren't good things. In fact, in the 16th century, you could license a dog, but you couldn't license a cat. So I want to know, okay, is it a male or a female? Is it a white cat, a black cat, if we can determine the color from, its genetic makeup and things like that. What size is it? There certainly wasn't any variety of cats then as there is today, but I want to know, what this cat looked like. Now, what was the cat on board for? There's other possibilities there too. What was it brought on board to help control rats? Was it a pet, or did they eat it? Because we've actually have a recipe from 1560 on roasted cat and how to cook it. So I'm, fond of cats myself, so I'm kind of hoping it was just the ship's mascot. But it tells us more about, people and what life was really like. you know, to give that a clearer picture of that.
No,
Than just what
I think that personal aspect you're talking about is so important. I tell you, I was joking about laughing when you were talking about Cassandra's presentation, because I remember reading that title, and I just want to read her title real quick: Spain's Golden Tupperware: Historical Analysis of Iberian Pez Production and Atlantic Trade in the 16th Century. And it really goes to the idea that the title is very important in your paper too. I think that really captivated me. I was really interested in that. I'm glad you explained what Pez was, because I was pretty sure it wasn't the candy. So I'm glad we got that clarification out there. I think the cat story is always great, because I think one of the things that we try to do in understanding the past is also personalize it. What was it like for the common person, the sailor, the individual there? And I think that's such an important aspect, especially that I think anthropology does so much better than history does sometimes. We tend to fixate on the big man, the major figure in person, whereas anthropology tries to talk about that society in general, which I think is so important. And I want to ask you kind of a societal question here with this expedition. You know, we have a mindset of what Spanish conquistadors look like. You know, was this a Spanish conquistador in the like of a Pizarro and a Aztec view, or was this a much different aspect, and maybe we don't understand Spain's colonization of the New World as well as we thought we did?
I think we could help answer some of that. We found leather shoes, leather shoe fragments anyway. So we can talk some, you know, a little bit about some of the clothing. On the land side, they found rivets that were probably associated with helmets that they wore, buckles and things. And so the land side, the organic preservation is terrible. So we don't find cloth fragments too much. We have found little tiny remnants of gold thread, so that people would weave into their clothing though. And so there were different societal members there for sure. And, you know, some people obviously were being more noble than other people as well. John Worth is really, you know, looking at things about how they laid out the site as he gets more and more into the, you know, directing that research, you know, on the colony site, the way the buildings, you know, he may have identified the house that belonged to the treasurer because they found a scale weight that would really only belong to that man himself to mark that. And so we're going to be able to kind of look at how things were laid out in the village, I think, eventually, which is going to tell more of that social hierarchy as well. This one's tough. You know, they were there for 2 years, but 2 years, they, you know, they could have really made an impression onto the land itself that, you know, we're going to be able to see those things. So great research, and, you know, we work with students, you know, trying to figure out, okay, you know, you need a thesis topic, and, you know, maybe, you know, you want to think about this aspect of it, and see what, you know, you can find. You know, they're going to tell us things that we haven't thought about too. That's what I like about, you know, the students. Sometimes they get excited and they'll come in your office and they go, look what I just found. You know, that's really cool.
Well, so, now you say that, I want to broach over to that, because I think that's a great topic to talk about. You know, again, you were talking about bringing undergrads and graduate students involved into this research. We're talking about multidisciplinary, cross disciplines aspect. And I really want to talk about that a little bit, because why is this so important to get more and more students involved in, and why this is such an important topic? You know, today we tend to focus on pushing everybody into STEM, which is great. It's fantastic. But why is it so important for us to really capture history, capture the anthropology, capture the archaeology of sites like these? And what are you doing at West Florida in particularly to really encourage students to embark in these type of careers and areas? Because it sounds like you guys are doing a fantastic job in recruiting and getting students involved in it. But why is this so important for the larger discipline across the board?
Well, it, you know, it strengthens our discipline. It they can add to it. We can't do it all. And so, they're the backbone of the research that we do, through the university, because, they're the manpower on the excavations. It's just Greg Cook and I, we couldn't excavate a ship by ourselves. We've been working together, forever on these ships, but, we use the students, and it gives them the training, for them, they want a career. We have a good track record of getting students employed in the field once they graduate. We give them lots of hands-on field experience for that. We're really, in the last couple of years, trying to engage more undergraduate research as well, to get those students involved in not just in the classroom, but outside research. We have a student scholar symposium every spring now. The students present. We send students to NCUR, the National Council for Undergraduate Research, and they've presented on topics related to this as well. And so it helps the discipline, and people are fascinated by it. I mean, there's good shows and bad shows out there, but people, I can't tell you, I'm sure it's happened, to you too. But, you meet someone and then they ask you what you do, and then they go, I always wanted to do that. I just never did. And so, a lot of people feel that way, and they have that interest. And so it's a story, and we learn from the past, and, we find out mistakes and we try not to repeat them. Today, historians are telling us a lot about the 1918 pandemic, that's helping, I hope it's helping us today with the pandemic, that we're currently facing. But, it raises us as a society to do this type of research. So, and there's different aspects. People like different parts of it.
No, I think that's exactly true. And that's one of the appeals, I think, of cross-disciplinary programs like you have right there, where you can focus on a particular aspect. You may have one person who really likes to do the diving, the hands-on type approach, whereas others more like the paperwork background, record searching, or more like the artifacts and what the different elements of the artifacts do. And I think that sounds like a great element you have there. Obviously, right now we're in the midst of I don't want to say attacks on history, but we're very cognizant of our history and putting our history into context. And I was wondering your perspective on that too. I think now, especially people in our profession, so much it's really important that we assist and tell people, this is the historical context, because unfortunately sometimes history and our history is canned into small little bite-sized chunks that are being manifested in statues and imagery right now. So I'm wondering about your perspective on what's our long-term goals should be doing in the profession that we have chosen for ourselves.
I think in different ways is really, this one specialized, report paper, may not have that great an influence, but when you can bring together, a synthesis of the work, then, it's much better. As you were talking, I was just thinking about, we've had a couple conferences, where, like you mentioned in Nassau, where everybody comes together and it gives that broader picture of what we're doing. We've presented this way at SHA before, Society for Historical Archaeology, where we'll have an all day or all morning session, and, be able to put those papers out in a manner that paints that whole picture. I think that's really what we need to be doing, is making sure that we try to give the more complete story to the general public than just the real specific ones sometimes. This is important. Pensacola, I mean, a lot of people, they've never heard of Luna. They didn't know the Spanish attempted, a settlement attempt in 1559, but it's their own history, and, Florida's history. And, they need to be, it needs to be taught. I grew up in Missouri. I never knew the Spanish came to Florida in the 1500s. I was taught about Jamestown and the English colonists, but that's not the whole story by any means. And so, we want to pay tribute to this early history and all, elements of it.
Well, I think that's such a big point you hit on there, John, especially the interdisciplinary aspect. And one of the things that I think NASO does very well is it brings together groups, not just historians, not just archaeologists, but, and again, try to synthesize that material into something that's usable, that uses multiple sources to really produce history that's good for professionals, but also for the general public in some ways too, to educate them. Because like you said, I teach an American history course. I was just doing some grading just before this, and try to break that mold of the United States starts on the East Coast and moves forever westward, really is not the true imagery of what we should be portraying to them. We need to be talking about a history that's much more complex, much more in depth. The problem with complex is it gets too complicated. And so we need to still make it understandable. And I think when you have aspects like you're doing with your research down there with Luna, you open that up to people to really, okay, you don't need to understand the entire picture, but let me show you one piece that may be of interest to you, and let's zoom in on that and be able to study that. John, I was going to take a break here for just 1 second. Is there anything else in particular you want to cover or discuss? We can go ahead and do that right now if you like.
Well, I think we've talked about, the program and all that works really well. I didn't know I was going to present actually a specific paper at NASO. I've presented at NASO before. I always enjoy the conference, and James Bradford, has been a long time member there. He was on my dissertation committee, and Harold Langley I know because my dissertation involved the gunboat Philadelphia up in Lake Champlain. But when we worked on the first shipwreck, the one that was found in 1992, Emmanuel Point 1, we found little drops of mercury, and they were sticking to some of the iron concretions because they like to bind iron and other metals and things like that. These little tiny drops, and we'd seen them. And then we were working in the stern of the ship, and so in an area it really narrows down, and the Spanish use what are called wireframes to finish that area out. And we had a dredge hose that was 4-inch diameter, but it was too big to really fit between the frames comfortably. And so we replaced the dredge hose with a 3-inch dredge hose that would work there. And the new one happened to be clear. Well, James Spyrick, a former ECU grad, Jim was working down there, and then he saw mercury in these sediments. And then as he swam over the hose that was lying on the seabed, he could see mercury was pooled inside there. So I went down, and then with the help of another diver named Chuck, we manhandled this hose underwater and were able to capture it all into a Tupperware container. Well, ultimately, we had 7 pounds of mercury, 250 milliliters in that. So, the thought of time, well, mercury is used in the amalgamation of gold. And so we thought, well, that's what it's going to be for. But if you look at the dates of all this, you find out they weren't really doing it. It was close to the time period, but just a little too early for that patio process to happen. Okay, so then, what's the mercury being used for? Well, then on the second Emmanuel Point ship, we also found more droplets of mercury in places on it. And then on the third ship, even though we've only excavated, a small area of that one, we found an area with droplets of mercury on that one as well. So all 3 ships had it. What were they using it for? And so, to then start looking at the historical sources, it's used, for medical reasons, and specifically to treat syphilis. And so I wanted to know, well, is it mercury from the New World? Is it mercury from the Old World? We had earlier student of mine, Andrew Marr, he looked at lead, the lead strips on the outside of the hull, and had isotopic analysis done. He was able to confirm that every strip of lead came from the same mine in Spain. And so I thought, well, we'll do something similar with our mercury. Well, it turned out to be this incredible challenge because chemists don't want to put mercury into these chambers, and it's a whole long story and all that. But it's almost undoubtedly was produced in the Almaden mines of Spain. And so, I looked into how was it produced and how was it transported and all these things, which, I found interesting and all that. Then more importantly, okay, what was it used for? Well, it's for medical, primarily to treat syphilis. Okay, so how was it administered? And so, I found early accounts where they were putting people in basically kilns where they would heat up mercury and then let the person sit in there with the vapor to shroud them, which is just horrible. And then, but more commonly, it was applied in the form of an unguent. And so then John Worth found recipes that he shared with me of how they took the mercury and primarily they mixed it with pig lard, and then it was spread like a salve over various parts of the body. And to do that, and but just the history of how they treated syphilis at the time. Different recipes. There's one recipe for the rich, and that one has rose petals and chamomile in it. So it must have smelled better. But just that, and then the idea eventually they learned how toxic mercury was, and even the physicians were advising to let the patient apply it himself, and then realizing they're killing more people with the mercury than were being killed by syphilis, and then eventually how syphilis was eventually put to rest by Paul Ehrlich when he invented salvarsan, which was an arsenic compound, and then eventually penicillin. But I thought, that's one of those, more focused studies, but it's a study that, people, general public, would find interesting as well. And that was going to be my topic at NASOL this year.
Confirms the suspicions of sailors just being problems wherever they go, having been a sailor for 7 years myself. So it doesn't sound too unusual for these sailors to be spreading a disease into the New World. Well, John, I want to thank you for taking the time to come on. This has been great. You've been able to cover a breadth of topics in here that are just amazing. And one of the things that's really piqued my interest is to hear from other West Florida students and professors who are going to present down there. It really makes me want our conference to definitely go on next year. So I want to take a moment. I want to thank John Bratten for joining us for our NASO video podcast. We'll have links to John's work and a lot of the references he had in our show notes. If you liked our video and our podcast, be sure to click on like on YouTube and give it 5 stars on your podcast provider. Please subscribe to our channel to receive updates as we continue to interview maritime and historians and archaeologists and anthropologists. You can follow NASO on Facebook or on Twitter at NASO_history. The best way to follow NASO is to become a member. As such, you receive our newsletter, our quarterly journal, The Northern Mariner, which we publish jointly with the Canadian Nautical Research Society. You can go to www.naso.org and click on membership to join. Again, I want to thank John Bratten for joining us today from his home in Alabama, where he's usually working hard in Florida in Pensacola. We want to thank his wife for listening to an Alabama fan talk for this long, and especially for the dogs to be nice and work with us in today's broadcast. And until our next talk, keep sailing.